If the story of Boris Johnson's £1 million man in Ukraine is true, to what extent has human morality degraded? The following information in this article is collected from the internet, and the content is currently being verified. This article only presents a hypothesis for the reader's consideration and does not affirm any unverified information. The story begins in September 2023, when former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson made an unusual trip to Ukraine. Not only was the typical entourage of former political leaders, advisors, security, journalists, present, but also a rarely seen public figure, Christopher Harborne, who public records and the press have noted transferred £1 million to the office of Boris Johnson Limited in November 2022. Details of the trip and this individual's role later appeared in the leaked document cache known as the Boris Files. Major newspapers, including The Guardian, leveraged this document set to raise the question, why would a private donor, with deep financial interests in the defense industry, accompany a former prime minister to a war-torn country, attend high-level meetings, and even be recorded as present at private gatherings? Fact-checked information. Before delving into the ethical analysis, we need to clearly separate what has been verified from what remains ambiguous. A transfer of £1 million into the company account named the Office of Boris Johnson Limited is recorded in the Register of Members' Financial Interests. The entry states a donation in kind, £1 million, date received, November 21, 2022. This is a public document, Register of Members' Financial Interests. This confirms that a £1 million sum was received relating to the private office Mr. Johnson ran after leaving Downing Street. A set of leaked documents, the Boris Files, is publicly available, released by the Distributed Denial of Secrets, IDOTSC Group, and several newspapers, including The Guardian, have reviewed and leveraged the contents to write a series of investigative articles. IDOTSC publish the file set, but the authentication of each document is the job of independent media organizations. Thus, a leaked document cache exists which the press has used to raise questions about Johnson's post office activities. Christopher Harborne has financial ties to Kinetic and has been publicly disclosed as a major shareholder. A regulatory news service, RNS, announcement by Kinetic noted that Harborne, via the entity AML Global Limited, had reported a significant shareholder. The major shareholder announcement document is public. This places Mr. Harborne among those with business interests in the defense sector. Kinetic and other defense contractors are involved in cooperation to support Ukraine, for example, supplying systems like Banshee target/drones, cooperation on 3D printing parts for Ukrainian forces via mod contracts. There are numerous specialized reports and official communiques mentioning UK defense companies working with Ukraine, as well as the 3D printing support project for Ukrainian forces via a Babcock and Kinetic collaboration under a mod contract. This indicates a pre-existing bridge between the defense industries of Ukraine and the UK, where commercial interests may exist. Regarding Harborne's presence in the Kyiv trip itinerary, the leaked document, itinerary, cited by The Guardian indicates Harborne was listed as advisor, Office of Boris Johnson in the document for attending some events, and there are shared photos at some events in Kyiv and Lviv. However, the exact reason for Mr. Harborne's accompaniment and his official role, if any, in the meetings have not been clearly explained by the involved parties. The central facts include the £1 million sum, the leaked Boris Files, Harborne's financial link to the defense sector, Kinetic, and Harborne's appearance in the trip itinerary. The data is backed by public documents or verified journalistic accounts. But, a significant gap remains between there is evidence of a relationship/contact and there is evidence of criminal activity or abuse of office for personal gain. Criminal accusations have not been proven, Johnson and Harborne both deny wrongdoing, and the origin of the leak, IDOTSC, while reviewed by multiple papers, still raises questions about the integrity, scope, and context of each detail. Assessment of information independence. Trust levels and limitations. When approaching a major leak and accusations involving intertwined public-private interests, it's essential to distinguish between layers of evidence. Original leaked documents. IDOTSC is a platform specializing in publishing leaked data sets. They often attract investigative reporters. However, this organization is not typically an official source, it is merely a publishing intermediary. Therefore, the appearance of a document on IDOTSC does not automatically prove its content is entirely true. Instead, it serves as a starting point for verification by independent media and official agencies, investigative reporters and major newspapers. The Guardian, as well as other press organizations, has reviewed and cited these files, comparing them with public records, for example, the Register of Members' Financial Interests, corporate RNS. When an independent newspaper cross-references evidence pieces and cites official sources, the trust level increases. However, the press must remain cautious. They present what the documents show and cannot turn inference into legal proof. denials and explanations from involved parties. Both Johnson and Harborne have made statements refuting the implication of wrongdoing. Johnson called the article garbage and attributed it to a Russian hack. Harborne stated the money was a donation to maintain political activity, not for personal gain. These statements must be cross-referenced with documentary evidence and cannot, by themselves, dismiss the evidence. However, their existence indicates the debate is ongoing and there is no legal conclusion. The level of independence and reliability of the story is, there is a substantial basis for legitimate questioning, i.e., public facts and leaked documents support suspicion, but not sufficient grounds to confirm criminal misconduct or a calculated conspiracy. Formal investigations, for example, by the Committee on Standards in Public Life, the Electoral Commission, or a judicial inquiry, are required to reach a legal conclusion. The media's role in investigating and using leaked documents is legitimate and necessary in the context of political transparency, but any subsequent heavy accusations must be based on legal verification. Ethical issues and conflicts of interest, possible scenarios. Based on the public facts, several ethical scenarios are possible, ranging from complete innocence to potential conflicts of interest. Scenario of innocence, behavioral aspect. The £1 million was a legitimate donation to a private company, not a political campaigning fund, aimed at keeping Mr. Johnson politically active. Harborne did not expect to directly profit from Johnson's actions, he is simply a private supporter. Harborne's trip to Kyiv may have been a personal journey, without participation in official meetings, or if he attended, it was only in a personal capacity as a supporter. Scenario of conflict of interest, ethical aspect. Harborne is a major shareholder in Kinetic, and has other investments in the military sector. Kinetic has operations related to Ukraine, supplying equipment/services, participating in technical support programs. Harborne accompanying Johnson, a figure with political influence and a welcome image in Ukraine, could create opportunities for Harborne to meet and expand relationships with Ukrainian officials or industrial partners, thereby indirectly facilitating contracts or product deployment. Simultaneously, the £1 million sum could create a sense of gratitude and increase access or subtle influence. While there is no direct evidence of selling influence, this scenario is the fundamental reason for public and press concern. Scenario of abuse of the former Prime Minister support mechanism. If the former Prime Minister's office receives public funds, public duty costs allowance, to pay for administrative personnel for public duties but simultaneously serves commercial or private interests, that would be a misrepresentation of the public role, an issue raised in investigations related to the Boris Files. Similarly, if the donation was structured to conceal a political purpose or unlawful political influence, for example, transferring as a service invoice between companies, there would be a legal issue. However, proving this requires an investigation into accounting documents, service contracts, and evidence of specific quid pro quo behavior. Greed, a path from personal ruin to community destruction. Once the facts and possible scenarios are clarified, we turn to the part you requested. If the story as described is true, i.e., money for access and influence exists, then this is a classic example of how greed can corrode personal morality, erode institutions, and ultimately impact the security and lives of innocent people. 1. Greed destroys the individual. At the personal level, greed, often manifested as a desire to accumulate power, wealth, and fame, diminishes moral judgment. A leader facing the intersection of public and private interest has two choices: prioritize the public interest, or allow the private interest to interfere. When the second choice is made repeatedly, the consequences are loss of personal trust. The story of a figure once seen as a moral symbol, or at least a strong voice in international affairs, is now suspected of selling out trust for economic gain. Trust is the hardest thing to restore. Once eroded, that individual becomes a tool for those seeking to exploit the relationship. Corruption of responsibility. Instead of community service, the duty transforms into a service providing facilities for the payer. This turns political ideals into commodities, especially originating from a nation judged as clean and known for transparency. In Johnson's case, if the reliance on private funding to maintain a post office leads to the prioritization of donors with industrial interests, this is not just a typical manifestation of greed corrupting a leader's morality, but bottomless greed in the face of human suffering. However, it must be reiterated, there is evidence of the money and the contact, but direct evidence of selling influence has not been publicly established. Since it has not been publicly established, assigning guilt to Johnson is akin to misleading public opinion at this time. 2. Greed doesn't just break a nation's institutions, it destroys multiple nations and communities. When multiple powerful individuals choose to trade power for benefit, the consequence is not just the ruin of personal reputation but also erosion of public trust in institutions. When the public perceives that policy decisions, or promises to support a country or a policy, can be swayed by commercial interests, they will doubt every other public statement. A populace lacking faith in its institutions will struggle to gather the necessary civil strength to face major challenges. Recent protests from Asia to Europe, from peaceful demonstrations to riots, are manifestations of this erosion of public trust, setting a precedent for buying influence. If the exchange of personal and public interests is not strictly handled, other actors, businesses, foreign donors, corporations, will see this as an effective model of behavior. This leads to a spiral. The more influence is bought with money, the weaker the institutions become, allowing privileged groups to gain even more control. It is particularly concerning when it originates from nations that always preach they are centers of integrity. This would set a precedent for other countries to regard it as normal and a bad precedent for society. Social polarization. When the public realizes that power can be bought, dissatisfaction grows, leading to a crisis of legitimacy. History is full of examples, from democracies reeling from financial scandals to authoritarian regimes solidified by cronyism. This shows that the impact of money on politics can lay the groundwork for prolonged crises, where relationships are valued more than competence. The question of legitimacy. If the complete story is described as true, many people would ask, what is driving the current conflict in Ukraine or other global conflicts? If the story is true, then the image of financing war for profit is correct. People will re-examine current conflicts. They are using human lives in conflict to enrich a specific interest group. 3. Greed can threaten national security and the lives of innocent people. Imagine a potential chain of consequences. If someone with financial interests in the weapons industry has access to decision-making or influences the viewpoint on supporting or not supporting a side in a conflict, then decisions about weapon supply, training, or intelligence sharing could be shaped by motives beyond national security. When foreign policy is dominated by commercial interests, there is a risk of escalating violence, if weapons are pushed, or delaying diplomatic solutions, if parties profit from the conflict. The consequence is that innocent people suffer harm, casualties, displacement, humanitarian crises. At the national level, the manipulation of institutions by private interests weakens the ability to make transparent and responsible decisions, making the nation vulnerable to exploitation by foreign partners, both through soft power and information intervention. This damages long-term security. In the context of Ukraine, the question is, if a donor with interests in a military contractor accompanies a former prime minister who is lobbying support for Kyiv, does a risk exist that this support, and related contracts, is partly shaped by commercial interests? If true, decisions related to supplying military equipment, which changes the battlefield situation, could increase violence and risk to civilians. While hard to confirm directly from the existing leaked documents, this is the reason for public concern. Where private interest intersects with security decisions, human lives can be traded. Furthermore, for Ukraine, if this is proven true, then all negative speculations about Ukraine would be confirmed, casting them as a villain in the conflict with Russia. If the story goes deeper, the truth could be even more devastating for the Ukrainian people, who trusted their current government and fought to defend their country. If the event in the story is confirmed as true, the loss of public faith in the current Ukrainian government. This crisis of confidence could plunge Ukraine into a new crisis spiral. When greed causes national collapse. History is not short of examples where the greed of a small group led to immense damage for the entire nation. In cronyistic authoritarian regimes, when the interests of the elite become state policy, the economy is distorted, business opportunities for the majority are eliminated, causing long-term instability. In democracies, financial scandals involving politicians, corruption, bribery, preferential contracts for acquaintances, reduce faith in the system, leading to civil crises, and even the rise of extremist populist movements. Examples include Madagascar, Georgia, Bangladesh, Bolivia, or even modern France. But if the £1 million man affair is true, it could uncover another horrifying face of the world. Human greed can push many innocent people to their deaths. Or even, human greed can make them sell their souls to the devil, becoming a tool and servant of the true Grim Reaper. And sometimes, a nation is destroyed by the greed of people who don't actually live in that nation. These lessons point out that greed is not just a personal sin but a pathology for institutions, or a virus that kills its host. If not detected and treated in time, it can spread and lead to severe consequences for the entire nation. The head of a nation needs to recognize the greed of their partners to prevent pushing their country onto the path of destruction. Greed, morality, and community responsibility. The £1 million man story, if fully confirmed, is not just a personal scandal, but a warning about how greed can infiltrate the political system. It erodes trust, corrupts responsibility, and ultimately puts many nations in a vulnerable situation. We, as citizens and media, have the responsibility, Not to accept the concise statement there is no proof or it's just speculation, nor to rush to judgment before an investigation. Instead, we must demand maximum transparency, independent investigation, and legal and regulatory measures to prevent recurrence. At a deeper level, this story poses a big question for society. Do we want to build a political system where the leader serves the common interest, or a political system where power can be bought and sold? When greed prevails, the first victims are trust, followed by security, lives, and the future of ordinary people.